thank you all for inviting me back. I was telling somebody this morning, it's always so pleasant to come. I come from Jacksonville, so I come down 95 and across 207. And every time I've come to Palatka, it has been sunny and the sky is blue and the trees are green. It's always just such a pleasant process to be here. So thank you for inviting me back once again. Each year, as Memorial Day approaches, I find myself reflecting on my own personal military history. The facts stay the same, the dates of service, the places I went, the things that I did. I was retired in 2006, but I find the impact of those military years endures. What does change, however, year to year, is my perspective. My family has a short but proud history of service. My father's parents did not serve, but my dad was in the Navy before I was born. There are only 2 pictures of him during this time. One is his standard military headshot with his little Navy headgear on, and the other is one of him in his dress blues opening the door of a car that he won in an on-ship raffle. His Navy uniform, the heavy woolen one with the big bell bottoms and that big square sailor collar, obvious name, was in a dress-up box in the basement when I was a kid. I wore it at least once for a Halloween costume. I still have his old pea coat. You can still barely see his service number stenciled on the inside lining. It's pretty tattered, but when it gets cold enough in Florida, that's still my heavy winter coat. My maternal grandfather was in the military most of his life. He was drafted for World War II and married my grandmother literally the week before he shipped out. Until my grandparents passed away, there was a photo of my grandfather hanging in the basement of their house. It was an odd size. It wasn't like an 8 by 10, or it was just a weird size black and white picture in a skinny, unremarkable frame hanging next to the wall near the pool table by the door where Grandpa would go into his workshop. I never saw Grandpa fix anything. He had a set of screwdrivers and some hammers. There was usually something broken laying on his beat-up workbench, but I never actually saw anything get fixed. But that picture hung right there where he would see it when he walked in that workshop. And it was a picture of him in his green dungarees of the time, leaning against a tank with his elbow propped up on the tread like he was waiting for his takeout order. The tank had the name Eleanor painted on it in white calligraphy by somebody with much enthusiasm but not much skill. Until I was an adult, I thought that was my grandfather's tank. My grandmother's name is Eleanor. I learned that after my grandfather passed that he was actually a transportation officer in the Army. He was responsible for getting the military's equipment from one place to the other, but he didn't drive that tank, or any tank for that matter. I wish I had the picture, but nobody knows what happened to it after both grandparents passed and the house was cleaned out. I felt like it might have been some kind of joke between my grandparents. Here, honey, I'm in the middle of a terrible war, but look, I found a tank with your name on it. Thinking of you. This was before memes. For quite a few years, I had this romantic notion as a child that I would grow up to be a tank commander. Big, loud machines tearing through the woods, blowing stuff up. My preteen heart longed to be inside of one of those machines. In hindsight, I'm glad I didn't become a tanker. Tank brigades spend much of the year in the field, away from soft beds and air conditioning. It's a hard, hot, dirty life inside those big machines. The Army fixed it for me anyway. Women were not allowed to become tankers until after 2015, long after I'd been retired. I did join the Army right out of high school. I joined the musician program where I played my flute, my piccolo, my saxophone in both concert and marching bands. And it was a great way for this small town girl to get out and see a little bit of the world. And my mother was relieved I was nowhere near a tank. When Operation Desert Storm happened, the Army asked for volunteers from non-combat units, and I stepped forward. The need was for truck drivers to support the supply chain operations, supposedly far away from the action. If anyone remembers Jessica Lynch, the supply truck driving soldier who had to be rescued by the Marines from the hospital in Nasiriyah after her convoy came under attack and she was taken hostage, you can see why, once again, I'm grateful the Army didn't pick me. After leaving active duty, I moved to Ohio and joined a reserve unit band. Many of the performances we did, ironically enough, were for reserve units from Ohio, Kentucky, and Pennsylvania when they returned from their deployment in Desert Storm that I didn't go to. And after a few years in Ohio, we moved to Georgia. There was no reserve band there, so I joined a National Guard unit right outside Savannah at Fort Stewart. I changed jobs and I became a carpentry and masonry specialist, which is completely unlike a flute player, I can assure you. It was supposed to be a safeguard job. I had just gone back to college. I didn't know what I wanted to be when I grew up. So I figured if I couldn't get a job at the end of 4 years where my degree was in, I could always get a job on a framing crew, right? People always need carpenters. I got a degree in construction management. So that fallback plan has never really panned out, but it seemed like a good idea. We only spent about 4 years in Georgia, and then we moved to Jacksonville. And there weren't any Guard or reserve units in the Jacksonville area that I was qualified for. I could have gone to Live Oak and become a well driller, but it was about as far away from me in Jacksonville as Fort Stewart was, so I just stayed in the unit at Fort Stewart. One Saturday a month, I'd get up at 4:30 in the morning, and I would drive to make the 7 o'clock formation time at Fort Stewart. And on drill weekends, I would stay at the guest house on Saturday night on base instead of driving all the way back to Jacksonville. A guest house is an Army version of a hotel. You can reserve a room for as long as you need, 1 night, 2 nights a week, and it's set aside especially for enlisted personnel and their families and retirees. I think it cost me like $18 to stay there for a Saturday night. Far cheaper than any hotel outside the base, and I didn't have to go through the base. Now, the guest house didn't have a name. Administration buildings and gymnasiums on military bases often get named after local heroes. But the guest house was just the guest house. And as you approach the check-in desk in the lobby of the Fort Stewart guest house, there hung a sepia-toned military-style headshot of a solemn man in uniform. And on the wall next to this picture, there was a military citation typed in the standard issue font on nondescript paper, but very nicely framed. And I want to read that citation to you. Lieutenant Colonel William T. McDaniel, Korea, Distinguished Service Cross, 27 August 1950 to 19 October 1950. Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel was captured by North Korean Army forces at Daejeon on 20 July 50. During the period of 27 August through 19 October 50, Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel was the senior officer in a column of some 370 American prisoners of war being marched from Seoul to Pyongyang, North Korea. The prisoners were suffering from wounds, hunger, disease, malnutrition, and the constant brutality of enemy guards. At great personal danger, Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel continually interceded with the captors for food, medication, and better treatment of his men. By personal example and with disregard for the retribution which followed his efforts, he organized his fellow prisoners towards assisting the wounded and weak, not allowing them to be left behind. Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel inspired the men and restored the will to live and resist among the soldiers in the column. Additionally, he sanctioned and materially aided the prisoners who planned to escape the enemy-held column. Resisting his own instincts for safety and survival, he declined to participate in several successful escape attempts of others because of his unfailing loyalty to and compassion for his fellow prisoners. Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel's refusal to break under mistreatment by his captors and inspirational leadership at a time when the North Koreans were intent upon breaking the morale and spirit of their captives finally led to his execution at the hands of the North Koreans at the Suncheon Railway Tunnel. Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel's courage and unwavering devotion to duty and his men were in keeping with the most cherished traditions and ideals of the military service and reflect great credit upon him and the United States Army. The President of the United States of America, authorized by an act of Congress on July 25th of 1963, has awarded the Distinguished Service Cross posthumously to Lieutenant Colonel William McDaniel. Given under my hand in the city of Washington, D.C., this 5th day of August, 1986, signed by President Ronald Reagan. I have not been able to find any other information about William T. McDaniel. The employees at the guest house didn't know about him other than his picture in that citation had hung in the lobby as long as any of them had worked there. Somebody, at some point, made huge efforts on his behalf, both in in getting him the Distinguished Service Cross awarded 36 years after his demise. I like to imagine that a relative worked at that guest house when it was first built, and he installed Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel's picture and that citation in the lobby at his own expense, and nobody ever questioned it. And everybody who has been to that guest house has seen it, and I hope maybe most of them even read it. I was deployed to Iraq in 2003 with my Fort Stewart National Guard unit. And as these things happened, I got divorced when I got home in 2005, and sometime later, I was dating a man we'll call Matt. Matt's dad was a Korean War vet, living in the Philippines with a young Filipino wife named Evie. He would come back to the States occasionally for medical treatment with the VA, but most of what I knew about David came from Matt's stories about him. The second time I saw David in the United States, the cancer he had been mostly ignoring had finally tipped the scales. David and Evie flew into the Jacksonville International Airport, and David Jr., his youngest son, picked him up, and they drove directly to the VA hospital in Gainesville. In a spare hospital room, surrounded by Matt, David Jr., Evie, and myself, David quietly passed away just a few days later. There was a small memorial ceremony held at the funeral home in Jacksonville Beach, which is where Jr. lived. A few old Army buddies came but didn't stay, and the service was short and simple. Later that afternoon, the family gathered at Junior's shabby second-floor walk-up apartment in Jax Beach for lunch and to comfort each other. Evie dug a small tattered box out of her suitcase. It was made of sturdy but thin cardboard, the corners reinforced with those old black metal braces. She gave the box to Matt and said he should have this. Matt opened the box, and it was full of his dad's Army medals. The family looked at each one, but other than the connection to the father and husband that wasn't there anymore, there was no meaning in the medals to them. The boys hadn't seen them before, didn't know what they were, or even what they were meant to represent. I was overcome and had to excuse myself to the rickety second-story deck to cry openly. Was this my inevitable future? My descendants solemnly passing around the trinkets that I had worked so hard to gather over a long life? I felt an overwhelming sense of futility. In the end, what I did or had done wasn't going to make any difference at all, especially if those around me didn't know or understand what that effort meant. Was my legacy going to be just the sum of the belongings that I left behind? I was raised believing that as a human being living in community with other human beings, I had a moral obligation to do what I could. Whatever I'm able to do, whether it be teach, build, heal, perform physical work, or any other talent or skill, I should do it to the best of my ability and for as long as I possibly can. As a corollary to that, it means that what I choose to do is important, whether those actions affect nobody except myself or everybody around me, including possibly people I won't even meet. This personal ethos made military service seem like an obvious choice, especially for a rambunctious teen who didn't think she had any use for college. The military is very good at making you feel like you belong to something much bigger than yourself. It's so effective that loss of camaraderie is the most common thing retired and former military members miss, because it's certainly not the chow. Even the stories of my dad that he told me about being in the Navy, highly censored for his young daughter's ears, I'm sure, taught me that working in community is a good thing, even if it results in an occasional hangover. Dad was Navy, I'm sure those hangovers weren't occasional. Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel is the epitome of what people should strive for, I believed, working to the very end with the abilities you have to make life better for the people around you. That was the right thing to do. My boyfriend's dad's silent and unceremonious death, however, was the real thing that life is. I didn't know Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel. I couldn't find anyone who did know him or of him. There's no Facebook page. There's no Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel Foundation. There's no yearly remembrance with his name on it. I can only imagine everything else about him other than the facts that were in that citation. I did know David and his family. I know the impact his service had on his two sons and what that meant to them. I remember hearing Matt and Junior talk about how David's military experience helped shape them into the men that they became. Evie loved repeating stories about David and his love of fishing and his hatred for the VA. Matt's love of camping is a direct descendant of his dad teaching his boys the jungle survival skills the military had taught him. And I imagine those stories were highly censored as well. Matt and I remained in touch for a while after our romantic relationship ended, bound by some mutual friends. I saw the pictures from when Matt and Junior flew to the Philippines the next year to scatter their father's ashes over his favorite fishing spot. They planned to make it an annual trip to keep Evie close and the memory of David alive for his granddaughters, Matt's two little girls. The story of Lieutenant Colonel McDaniel and everyone like him is important. The legacies of these unknown heroes serve to guide subsequent generations. His story points a way towards selflessness, service, courage, and commitment to a greater cause. And don't get me wrong, war is terrible. I'm not advocating for conflict. There are plenty of stories from outside of the military as well, people who don't get plaques and citations, but whose influence continues to serve and guide us, even if we didn't know them personally. David's legacy is alive in the memories of his sons, his wife, and even me. And in a way, he's a part of you now too. So maybe not getting to the citation is the better option. As for me, I'm going to work on creating memories based in service, generosity, love, and patience. Then I think the legacy part will take care of itself. Thank you.